Good evening and welcome to the 12th Annual London History Festival, brought to you by Kensington and Chelsea Libraries. This year we are hosting the festival online, but this enables us to reach many people who otherwise may not be able to join us, and also to invite speakers from abroad. So welcome to you all, wherever you are tuning in from. The London History Festival was begun in 2009 with an aim to bring the work of the finest historians to the widest possible audience. This year we have 8 evening talks with 8 wonderful authors presenting their latest books in a program of virtual events we hope will both entertain and enlighten. Our guest tonight is Johanna Katrin Fredriksdottir, a medievalist and literary scholar who is joining us from Oslo. Johanna's work is about Vikings, medieval Iceland, and the reception of these in the modern era. Her publications include numerous articles, an edited volume, and 2 books about medieval literature and manuscripts. She currently works at the National Library of Norway in Oslo and also acts as a historical consultant for documentaries and feature films. In her fascinating book, Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World, Johanna uncovers the reality behind the myth and legends to reveal the dynamic and diverse lives of Viking women. Johanna's presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, and she has kindly agreed to take some questions at the end. You can post a question using a chat function, which you will find at the top of your screen. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you and to welcome to the London History Festival this evening's speaker, the historian, Johanna Fredriksdottir. Hello, Johanna.
Hi, Nina. Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for inviting me. And we were just talking before we started, and I thought I could just explain to the audience about my name, since I know it's such a big mouthful and looks very scary, but it's just Fredriksdottir, and that means that my father's name is Fredrik and I'm his daughter. And this is the patronymic system that is still used in Iceland, but everyone in Scandinavia in the Viking Age used it as well. So I'm just gonna start the talk now, and you can see there on the first slide this beautiful Viking longship, which is a replica of the Oseberg ship, which was found in a big burial, and I'm going to mention that towards the end of the talk again. But I just thought about this wonderful ship now, and in this time of lockdowns and repeated sort of restrictions that most of the world is going through. It's maybe a little bit ironic to begin with such a beautiful ship and thinking about traveling. But traveling is really the most sort of defining characteristic of the Viking Age. Mobility and travel was what made the Viking Age what it was. Although Scandinavians were predominantly farmers in the Viking Age, that's not really what we picture when we think about Vikings. We think about muscly men sailing on their formidable longships all around Northern Europe. To harry and raid, probably. Most people think about that. The word Viking is used for people who left their homes in Scandinavia, either temporarily or permanently, to plunder and return with the goods, to fight wars and conquer new territories, but also to trade, explore the world, hunt for new resources, and settle in previously uninhabited lands. Starting sometime in the last decades of the 8th century, the next 300 or so years are called the Viking Age. These were a time of profound changes, a period of massive expansion in all directions from Scandinavia. The improved design of these Viking ships, longships, enabled Vikings to travel longer distances around the North Sea, the Baltic, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and up and down the rivers of present-day Russia and Ukraine, where they traded, raided, and settled as the opportunities presented themselves. The resulting flow of wealth into Scandinavia helped the magnates who spearheaded these journeys to secure loyalty from supporters and knock out competition, eventually allowing the stronger ones to consolidate rule over larger regions. The stereotypical image of Viking women among all this is that they were at home taking care of the children, waiting for the men to come back with all these riches. But as I show in the book, they were very much a part of this expansion that underpinned these changes. They moved to the Norse urban centers that burst onto the international commercial scene. Libe and Hedeby in Denmark, Birka and later Sigtuna in Sweden, Kaupang in Norway, York and Lincoln in England, and Dublin in Ireland. They accompanied men to raid and colonize all over Europe, traded furs, walrus blubber, and hides with the Sami far north in the Arctic, and sailed along the coast of Poland and deep down the Russian rivers, where Scandinavians established the Rus kingdom. Vikings explored lands in the west, largely unknown to Europeans at the time. They settled in Iceland and Greenland, and they made an attempt to operate in North America, although that was short-lived. But we do know that women made it as far as that too. Here's the sort of reproduction of the Viking settlement that's been excavated in Lanzo Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. So in other words, life could be quite exciting for a Viking woman. And tonight I thought we could travel both back in time and far away, all the way to this place, following in the footsteps of two women who, according to the Icelandic sagas, traveled further west than any European had at the time. These women take us all the way to first Greenland and then North America around the year 1000, when an Icelandic saga called Erik's Saga Rauða, or Saga of Erik the Red, tells us that a group of people set off from Greenland to relocate to a country where some of them had previously arrived when their ship was blown off course. The saga was written down 250 or more years after the events it describes, and it says that the two women called Gudrid and Freydis, who were among these travelers, Gudrid had moved to Greenland from Iceland with her family as a little girl, and before this journey she had survived famine and an epidemic that killed her first husband, so she had already been through a lot of both travel and life experiences at this point. The group sails into the unknown from Greenland, past lands that are too inhospitable to make them worth exploring. But eventually they find a place they called Vinland, naming it so after the vines that were growing there. The group stays for 3 winters exploring the land and interacting and trading with the natives. And during this time, Gudrid gives birth to a baby boy and Freydis gets pregnant. Although the relationship between the Norse newcomers and natives was mostly peaceful, it was a precarious one as well, and eventually it sours, and one day the natives attack, causing the Norse to flee to their ships. When Freydis sees this, she berates the men for their cowardice as they run away, in sort of traditional saga heroine style. But she stumbles after her companions nevertheless. However, she moves very slowly and falls behind because of her pregnancy. Seeing 2 of the group lying dead on the ground, Freydis realizes that she is out of options, and astonishingly, she turns to face her pursuers. Perhaps an instinct to protect her unborn child brings out the fight in her. Or perhaps she's a really tough woman who would have done this under any circumstances. Whatever the case, she has everything to gain and nothing to lose. She sees a sword lying by one of the bodies, and snatching it up, she takes her bare breast out of her tunic and slaps it on the blade. Fortunately for her, this move has a startling effect on the natives. Although they far outnumber the expectant mother, of course, something about this strange sight alarms them, and they return to their canoes, paddling away. Freydis escapes the attack unscathed, and she manages to find those of her companions who got away with their lives as well. And soon they set sail home, back to Greenland, never to return to this dangerous place they called Vinland. Freydis's bold portrayal in the saga needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Her character has much in common with other women in Norse literature, many of whom do this thing where they egg their sons and other male relatives to take up weapons. And they sort of ruthlessly incite and shame them to go and enact some violence. There's also examples of young mothers in the sagas showing exceptional heroism to protect their babies from harm. For example, there's a woman called Astrid, who is the mother of the future king Olaf Tryggvason. We learn about her in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason. She has to go into hiding from the boy's father's enemies when he's just a baby and flee from Norway. At one point during her escape, she even conceals herself and her little son in a tangle of reeds to keep safe. But after an arduous journey, they both make it to Sweden. So there is this sort of saga trope of the brave young mother that the portrait of Freydis might be drawing on. When Erik Saga's author imagined what it might have been like to be a woman like Freydis in this situation in a faraway place with attacking natives, this is the kind of tradition that they were drawing on, and they made her sort of fearless in the face of danger. So the Norse attempt to colonize Vinland, this group, this was a short-lived failure according to the saga. But how do we know that this is anything to do with the truth, and that all these people made it over there when all these generations of people back in Iceland were retelling the story again and again? And over several hundred years, of course, they would have been retelling, changing and embroidering the story. So how do we know that this is anything more than fantasy, that the Norse actually got to North America? In the early 1960s, archaeologists discovered and excavated a site on the northern tip of Newfoundland in eastern Canada that I showed before, where they found houses built in the traditional Norse style and artifacts including a small spindle whorl and other textile equipment. A spindle whorl is this thing. It's a very small round object with a hole in the middle. It's like a tiny donut, if you will. And it's a crucial part of the toolkit necessary to make textiles. So it was put on a stick and then dropped to the floor, to the ground. And then you would spin it at the same time as well. So if you had some fleece, and you can see here in the picture, she has a little bit of fleece in her hand. And you've already kind of processed this fleece from your sheep. And then the weight of the spindle whorl here and the sort of spinning motion is going to twist it into some yarn. And then you can use the yarn to make garments. These spindle whorls could be made from a variety of material. Here's one in lead, and this one was found in Lincolnshire, where the Vikings were also settling and moving around. Although unlike the expedition to America, that was a more lasting project. And I'll just show you a reproduction of that same spindle whorl. And it's really interesting because it has a runic inscription. So the runes are basically just the sort of Norse alphabet. There's nothing very mysterious about the runes per se. It's just a writing system. But this spindle whorl has something about Odin and Heimdall, so that's quite interesting. So archaeological and textual evidence suggests that textile work was overwhelmingly the job of women, and so that's why we think that the spindle whorl in Newfoundland suggests that women were on an expedition. Whether it was the one that the saga tells about or some other one, we'll never know. But at any rate, textile archaeologists have suggested that women were sort of spinning and weaving in between other tasks, even on their travels. And they could, in fact, expand the household's income as well as producing, enough material and clothes that, just for clothing the family. But they could maybe even expand the household's income by selling either wool or fabric. And some might even have been setting up small businesses, producing textiles on a larger scale, like in workshops, maybe even on a seasonal basis. Running a textile business must have been able to give women some possibilities to increase their prosperity and move up in society of their own accord. Just showing you a picture of a woman here, a reenactor weaving in the traditional style. Textile work was the most important and time-consuming work of the era, probably. And without it, people wouldn't have had any clothes, nor would the Viking ships had any sails. Clothes and textiles were extremely valuable, given that they needed to be handmade from scratch. From rearing the sheep and growing fields of flax or hemp, to harvesting fibers, processing, spinning, dyeing, weaving, cutting and sewing, or needle binding yarn to make finished garments. This was a really long process, and it required a lot of specialized knowledge and skills. And just as an aside, the strong colors that you see in this picture and the one previously, these are actually true to life, that the Vikings wore bright colors, not just sort of drab natural ones. And they dyed the yarn using both natural and chemical dyes. So back to the production of sails. Research has shown that it would have taken one person 4 to 5 years of full-time work to make a sail large enough for a fully sized Viking ship. So a team of maybe 10 skilled workers would have been working for an entire winter maybe to make one sail. So you can see how enormously expensive and important a sail is. And you see that reflected on these picture stones that are from Gotland, which is an island in the Baltic outside of Sweden. And there's lots of these picture stones, and a lot of them have ships, motifs of ships, and they always have prominent sails on them. So we know that this is something that they thought was important to depict in their art. So without this work, women's textile work, the Viking expansion would never have been possible, probably, because in order to sail all these long distances that you needed to go, to get all these resources that they came back with, and to do all the things they did. You needed to have sails. The ships wouldn't have gone anywhere without them. And you also needed all kinds of utility fabrics and warm clothing and so on. And so without textile work and without women's contributions, the Viking Age probably just would never have happened. And that means that women were completely indispensable to the economy, no less than men. So the constant need for textiles probably meant that this work was ubiquitous, and most ordinary women were probably just doing it all the time. They spent big parts of their days spinning and weaving. The link between women and textile work carries over from this realm of ordinary life and its sort of mundane drudgery into the more glamorous world of Viking warfare and mythology. There's a poem about one of the most famous Viking battles of all time, the Battle of Clontarf, which was fought in Ireland in 1014. And this poem pictures the onslaught, the battle, as a metaphorical weaving in another dimension. And now I can finally introduce the Valkyries, the sort of titular heroines of my book. And here's a few sort of artistic impressions of them. One here from the Viking Age. It's a sort of small pendant or amulet, which probably depicts Valkyries. And then these sort of more national romantic ones, maybe. So in this poem, or in Norse poetry and sagas that were mostly written down in the 13th century and later, every warrior's destiny was down to the will of these supernatural women, the Valkyries, who were sent from the mythological realm Asgard by Odin to the human realm Midgard. Riding on horseback, they hovered over the battles and determined which of the warriors would be hit by spears or arrows or swords, and who would survive. They would then swoop down and take the dead ones with them to the afterlife. These warriors would fight for sport during the day and feast in the evenings until Ragnarök, the great war that is the doom of the gods, in which they are enlisted, that is the dead warriors, they're enlisted to fight the hostile armies of the gods' enemies that march on Asgard. So one poem relates that on the same day as the Battle of Clontarf was fought, there was a man called Darragh who saw 12 mysterious people enter a house with a weaving room. He approached the building and then he got really curious. His curiosity got the better of him. So he peered into the room and he wanted to see what these mysterious people were up to. And at first everything looked very normal. The figures that he had spotted turned out to be women. And they had begun to weave on what in those days would have been a standing warp-weighted loom, which was another standard equipment of textile work. But soon it became clear to Darragh that this superficially domestic scene was an event of utmost horror. The warp and the weft, which made up the fabric that these people were producing, were entrails instead of yarn. The weights keeping the warps taut were human skulls, not stones. And the women used a sword and an arrowhead as tools to weave their bloody fabric. And to keep up the rhythm while they worked, the Valkyries energetically chanted songs about the unfolding battle. The spear women, as the Valkyries call themselves, revel in the clashes of swords and shields, the spattering of blood, the spilling out of entrails. Their work gains momentum with the song's refrain. I'm just showing you a picture here of one of the manuscripts of this poem, and I'll just read it out. A wide warp warns of slaughter. Blood rains from the beam's cloud. The warp is woven with warriors' guts and heavily weighted with the heads of men. Spears serve as heddle rods, spattered with blood, and arrows are the pin beaters. We wind and wind the web of spears. There where the banners of bold men go forth, Valkyries decide who lives or dies. And you can see here, Vindum, Vindum, that's we wind and wind. Vev daravar. So this is what they are sort of, it's a refrain in the poem, and it appears again and again, and it really sort of builds the momentum of the poem, and we can sense the battle escalating as they're weaving. The Valkyries boast that they have the men's life in their hands, and they promise to protect the leader of one of the warring sides against the onslaught of weapons. Their victory songs, as they call them, and suddenly we can assume that the chosen warriors have now fallen, and the women tear up the red-gray textile they had woven, each of them holding on to their share. The Valkyries exit the building and ride off on their steeds, some to the north, others to the south. Presumably they made their way to the battlefield to fetch the dead and carry them off to the afterlife. These verses are among the most gruesome poetry in Norse literature, and their depictions of Valkyries as gleeful, blood-stained, terrifying, even revolting creatures might come as a surprise to anyone who's familiar with Valkyries from popular culture. In a mythological treatise by the Icelandic author Snorri Sturluson, who lived in the early 13th century, this synthesizes a lot of material that he kind of gathers from different sources, and he writes it all down into a kind of streamlined version. And he sort of waters the Valkyries down, really, into the image that most people are familiar with today. In his version, they're not really that interested in all the blood and the gore and the entrails and everything. And they kind of just become these cliches. They're like fantasy figures. They're sort of, I would call them a little bit anemic comparatively. They're greeters and waitresses in Valhalla that serve drink to the slain warriors. But the compound word Valkyrie actually, it goes back etymologically. On one hand, Val, which is the slain, so it's the word that's used for like all the dead warriors that are lying on the battlefield, and then Kiri comes from the verb to choose, so it's much more about like choice and battles and the dead than about serving drink, I would say. So we don't really know exactly why Snorri sort of emphasizes this aspect of them more so than the more scary aspect. But it's sort of interesting also that the goddess Freyja, who is probably the best known Norse female deity, she also has these kind of associations with mobility and agency, but that's also maybe a lesser known aspect of her that people tend to focus less on. So I'm just going to talk about how Freyja, like the Valkyries, has sort of associations with agency. And so you might have heard of her before, sort of in some of the terms that she has. She has this carriage that's drawn by cats, and she also has a feather cloak, so she's able to fly and she's able to travel around in her carriage, and so she's very mobile. And she also has her own realm called Folkvangur, And there's a myth about her, which is really interesting, that I'm not going to talk about now, but she goes off to the realm of giants, actually, and meets with a giantess and asks her lots of questions about the past. And that makes her very similar to Odin, who does that a lot in the myths. But the best known text that Freyja appears in is probably the mythological poem Thrymskviða, or Thrym's poem, which in this poem, to her horror, there's a fearsome giant called Thrymr who tries to get Freyja as his wife by stealing Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and then he demands her as ransom for the hammer. And so all the gods are kind of, they think this is a great plan, but then when Freyja is told about it, and that she's expected to marry this giant to save their skin, she vehemently rejects the idea, and she indignantly snorts in rage, basically, so that her necklace, which is kind of famous in the myths, Brísingamen, comes apart. And so Thor and Loki, the two gods who had hatched this plan, they have to leave her hole with their tails between their legs. Freyja is sort of a shadowy figure in Snorri's Edda, the treatise that I mentioned before. It generally tells us comparatively little about her, in relation to all of the long myths that you get about Loki, for example, and Thor and Odin. But there is one short myth that I think is really interesting, where she's kind of the heroine and maybe unacknowledged heroine. But there is this giant who comes to Asgard, to the god's realm, and Thor is away. And Thor is the one who's the muscle, so he's always able to protect the gods. But as he's away, they don't really know what to do, and so he's demanding hospitality and to be treated nicely. And so it's really Freyja who sits him down and takes him some ale and like deals with him basically, and placates him until Thor comes back and is able to sort of do away with him, really. So she's very brave, considering that none of the other gods, male or female, will deal with this intruder. And then there's one more thing that I can mention. Again, going back to the Valkyries, that's not a quotes actually a stanza from a mythological poem, which states that Freyja receives half of the slain after the battles, and Odin, who is the highest god, receives the other half of the slain. So if this information reflects an actual Viking Age belief that, like, if you're a warrior, you know that you're either going to go to Odin or to Freyja, this surely puts her on comparable footing with Odin. It's just kind of a passing reference, and it's not really elaborated on, and it's the only explicit information that we have about this role of Freyja's. But based on all of these episodes, we're just left with this vague notion that she might have had a more prominent role in the Norse pagan belief system than is maybe acknowledged, or that we can gauge from the extant sources. And to sum up, so Freyja, she gets half of the slain in battle. She is the only one who possesses enough courage to deal with this unruly giant invader, and she refuses to marry a suitor that she considers unworthy of her. So first and foremost, these motifs, I would argue, suggest a connection, a conception of Freyja, as having been perceived as noble, assertive, and powerful. I just want to sort of stress this because she's often kind of mentioned as, she's the fertility goddess, but I don't really see very much kind of evidence for much of a fertility aspect of her. But this independent and high status of Freyja brings me to women's status in real life, and whether they had a similar level of agency as in the myths about the Valkyries and Freyja, who are deciding things. And I don't want to suggest that Norse society was a gender equal society. It was in very many ways very staunchly patriarchal. For example, young women, just going to show you a picture of some Lord manuscripts. Young women were not allowed to decide whom to marry. Sisters did not inherit as much as their brothers. So, you know, those are two examples of Old Norse society or Old Norse laws not being equal for the genders. Other laws give women, however, the right to reject a marriage proposal if they are widows. And some of the laws say that women can get divorced, that they can attend and participate in assemblies if their husband is ill or away, and spend a fixed amount of money without their husband's permission, although the husband did not have to ask his wife for permission to do any business on the other hand. We do have to qualify these rights of women, though, with the awareness that enforcing them was a whole other matter. It was not a given, and it might sometimes have been impossible in reality, whatever the laws said. For example, the sagas suggest that married women could not really, like the sagas show examples of women trying or wanting to get out of a marriage, but they can't really get a divorce if their family is against it, nor could you reject a suitor if you were a widow necessarily, if the match was the will of somebody very powerful, such as a king or a magnate. But on the other hand, some saga women achieved remarkable power, such as, for example, the Deep-Minded, who we learn about from the saga of Erik the Red again. Highly recommended reading. She escaped a civil war in Scotland in secret. She moved to Iceland and took possession of a significant piece of land. And in reality, although it might have been a real person, she's still, we have to think about her as a literary figure. But we have evidence, for example, of runestones that demonstrate women's strong social status. Runestones, what are these? So these are stones that people put up in public places usually. Sometimes they carved into stones that were already there in nature, but a lot of the time they would transport a stone and then they would have an inscription, often in memory of someone, have this carved into the stone. And often it was in kind of very nice, you can maybe see a little bit here, the sort of knots and twists and serpents and so on. This one isn't particularly nice, but it was actually carved by a woman, which is quite rare. Like it's not, runestone raising seems to have been a profession, carving, sorry. But anyway, all of these 3 runestones have associations with women, and they're a little bit like we put up statues today in some public area. So it's about making a statement. They often stand by crossroads where people would see them when they went about their daily business. And although most of the stones were raised by men to commemorate their father or son or other male relative, some of them were commissioned by or for women. The Hillesjö stone in Sweden, this one, this has the 2nd longest runic inscription of all time of any runestone. And it tells a sad story about a woman called Gerle who lost her entire family, and she was quite old, but she ended up inheriting almost everyone. Another stone was raised in Norway by Gunvor in memory of her daughter Astrid, the handiest maid in the region, according to the inscription. The inscription is like on the side here. And then there's pictures from the Bible on the front. So this woman was Christian. And so she was also making a statement about her religion. And I've already said that this stone was carved by a woman called Gunborga. So finally, I'm going to go back to the ship that I started with. And because we've been talking about runestones, they were obviously often, they were always raised in connection with somebody dying, really. And women, I've told you about the women being commemorated in these two inscriptions by other women. And we can tell that women were respected and admired in Norse society frequently by the way they were treated in death. We have evidence from all over the Viking world of people burying their wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, grandmothers with as much splendor as they could afford, putting carefully selected objects or animals in their graves, and sometimes even burying them in boats or with horses. But the most splendid Viking grave of all time, really, this was not a family-based burial, but one that the entire community would have witnessed and participated in, probably. In the year 834 in Oseberg in southern Norway, just maybe 45 minutes south of where I live, two women were buried in a full-size Viking ship with an enormous amount of grave goods, including a beautifully carved wagon with cat motifs that I'll show you later, a sleigh, a weaving loom, and all the necessary textile equipment, clothes, leather shoes, 5 beds with bed covers, a throne-like chair, 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 cows, assorted tableware, an exotic bucket with a Buddha figure, and chests of food. And there are also remnants of a tapestry with mysterious imagery that may depict Norse pagan rituals. This grave has enthralled people since it was excavated over 100 years ago. And various theories have been put forth about the identities of these two women, one of whom was over a stately 70 years old. You can see, I mean, if you ever have the chance to go to Norway, you cannot miss this. It's amazing to see it in real life, just how intricate. Like, this is the ship itself, like here, and then this is the wagon, and you can see there's a cat here who looks like he's doing a facepalm. And then this is like a reconstruction of the tapestry. And it has all these people riding on wagons and carrying, like lots of people carrying things, like spears. And it's really intriguing, this tapestry, and we don't really know what's on it, but it might depict the actual funeral. So judging from the absolutely staggering cost of this burial and the prominence of the grave mound in the landscape, I'm just going to show it to you. It rises above the rest, which is very flat. So due to the prominence of this burial, we might interpret one or both of the women who were in the grave as exceedingly important and high-profile figures. Perhaps she or they were a ruler, chieftain, or a monarch. At any rate, the funeral seems to have been on par with modern royal funerals in terms of just the pomp and circumstance and the cost. Moreover, the mound would have kept the dead women's reputations in cultural memory for generations. So every time somebody is walking, past that burial mound, they think of them, or you would tell the story or something. Their descendants or successors to power may have broken into the mound as well to bolster their claims to rulership. The Oseberg grave should not surprise us, however. Looking at the cumulative evidence of runestones, mythological figures like Freyja and the Valkyries, women, textile workers and business owners, explorers and settlers, whether in real life or in sagas, just to name some of the available evidence. This suggests a collective determination by women in the Viking Age to take up space in their world, and that it also suggests that there were ways to achieve this. And a culture with a narrative tradition and a collective imagination that produced poems like the Song of Gudrid that I talked about before must have been driven by women who decided. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. All I have left now is to say thanks to the London History Festival for having me. And if you want to learn more about Viking women, I have written this book called Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World. It's available at bloomsbury.com. And in the book, there's much, much more content than I was able to cover, obviously, in such a short presentation. And you can also find my website where I have lots of links and things, and my Twitter is there. And then I've worked on a podcast. I co-produced it with a colleague about Gudrid and Freydis, the two women that I was talking about at the beginning, along with some other women from the sagas. So thank you for your attention, and I'll send it back to Nina.
Thank you, Johanna. That was really enlightening, and I'm sure people enjoyed it because we have a lot of people in the audience and already quite a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. So let me go to them. Nikki Moxie says, I'd love to know more about the dyes used that you mentioned at the beginning.
Oh, the dyes, yeah. I mean, the plant-based dyes are plants like madder, yeah, and woad, and all sorts of different plants that people are picking, essentially. And there's a lot of knowledge involved in, when to pick them and whether to dye immediately afterwards, and so on. I don't really have all of that at my fingertips, but then they also used chemical dyes that they imported from, maybe the Silk Road somewhere, Middle East or even further. But that would have been extremely exclusive, probably. And then there's some variation in like how popular the colors were. So like in Iceland, a lot of women are, for example, buried in blue, and nobody really knows why, and whether blue had some kind of association with death, or yeah, like why, but it's really, I think, an interesting detail.
Yes, morning color. I found it really interesting when you said that Vikings used a lot of very bright colors, because I do love watching TV shows with Vikings in them. And I think there's a question from somebody anonymously, what you think about the portrayal of Viking women in shows like Vikings, if you've seen it. Do you have a comment on that? How do you think the Vikings are portrayed on TV and in films that we are watching at the moment?
I think there's just a lot of variation. I think some characters, and like some producers do a really great job, do lots of research, and then, you know, at the other end of the scale, there's a lot of cliches just with any other sort of any other type of genre, really. But I really enjoy, particularly, there's a show called Norseman, which is actually Norwegian, and you can see it on Netflix. And they kind of make fun of some of the stereotypes of the Vikings in a way that I find very amusing.
Wonderful. That's a good plug. I'm going to rush over to Netflix after this to check that out. Somebody wants to know, can you use leather animal skin for sails? Would that be too heavy?
Oh,
maybe it's a technical question.
I've read a lot of archaeology, and I've never read about anyone using leather. And I would think, I mean, for Viking sails, I don't know about other cultures or periods in history, but I would think that just the amount of work, like, I mean, it was a lot of work to make wool sails, but like, obviously parchment that people wrote manuscripts on were made out of animal hides, and that was a huge amount of work to get them, you know, from being like just a dead animal. So I would just think that just the amount of work, if nothing else, and the weight would make it impossible to make such a huge piece. But I've never heard of this, as I say.
It seems impossible, yes, to make it into a sail. I don't know if this is a humorous question. Did Vikings also invent wheels? They were inventors and loved adventures, weren't they?
They were, yeah. I mean, they, for example, this improvement in technology of the sails, that was something to do with the mast and so on. But I don't think they invented wheels. I mean, they didn't invent runes, for example, either. Really, I mean, they were sort of based on the Latin alphabet, and yeah, but I'm not really I'm not really sure.
Okay, it's fine. You can't, you know, if it's outside of your field of expertise, it's good to say that. Alexa Parker has a comment and a question. She says, one of the moments from your book that struck me the most was when you talked about Freydis in the Vinland Saga. I'm really interested in how you spoke about her attempts to shame the men into fighting, and when they don't, she has no choice but to take matters into her own hands and do the fighting herself. Is this a common response for women to take matters in their own hands in the sagas when men do not respond to shaming?
No. Usually the shaming works because it's so awful for a man to be called, you know, a coward or a woman. I mean, because they usually say things like, I'll give you the keys to the pantry and I'll take the weapons. And so they're essentially saying, you know, you're not being a man. But usually the men respond. But then there are these scenes, like there's a famous scene where somebody's brother has been killed, and she is kind of taking food to the table of his killer, and then she sees this weapon lying on the ground, and like she picks it up and goes at him and kind of stabs him in the thigh. So these kinds of exceptions, I mean, they're very few, and they're always kind of spur of the moment. But I think that Freydis is kind of unique in that, yeah, she's clearly out of options. I mean, there is no one there. So.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions that might be actually interesting here. So somebody wants to know, did Viking women fight alongside the men, and was this world really as brutal as it's often depicted?
Yeah, I think it was pretty brutal. If you read around in both the sagas and the archaeology, I mean, there's like a famous burial, for example, in Oxford, and they found, you know, just this pile of bodies of Norse warriors who had run into some bad luck somewhere in Oxford, and they'd just all been killed and thrown into a mass grave. And I mean, I would love to be able to say that there were lots of Viking women fighting and there were just whole troops of them. I think there's no evidence for that. I think there was probably the odd woman who did, but I think when you were raising a girl, you wouldn't have necessarily taught her, or like, you know, women wouldn't have been trained to become warriors in the same way as the men. And then when they are they are with the Great Army, for example, marching in England. But I sort of doubt that they were necessarily fighting, because there are sources that say that they were put away before battles, for example, put in a secure location. And I could go on for much longer about this, but I'll stop here just to get more questions in.
Yes, we do have lots, and I shouldn't make any prolonged comments. So are there any other instances of human body parts being used as parts or resources for textile work?
Human body parts?
Yes, I think you mentioned at one point that spindle that was really made of entrails, or the loom.
Oh yes.
Is this not? This is not common.
No. It's usually not quite this gruesome. No, I mean, there's a famous scene, for example, in the saga of the people of Laxau Valley, where somebody kind of kills a woman's husband, and then she's standing there, and he wipes his sword like on her garment. But that's, I think, sort of as bloody as it gets, off the top of my head, at least.
So were women freer in distant lands such as Iceland or Russia than the Norse women?
I think it's difficult to say, but sort of, I think women were probably freer in urban settings sometimes than in rural settings. But then, yeah, it depended a lot on the woman herself and the circumstances. And I mean, there's an example that I really think is interesting of a woman who's quite high status, and she's in a really bad marriage, but and she's in Iceland. This is in Erik Saga, and she has to stay in the marriage because she just has no other place to go, and her brother, who's like her main other male relative, doesn't want her to get divorced from this man, and so she's just stuck. Whereas, like, there are some suggestions, like there's a Latin source that talks about this woman who lived in Birka, I think in the 9th century, and she's just kind of living her life, and seems to have been quite well off, and she was donating property to her church and so on. And so it's like, I sort of speculated in the book that if you're in a city that or a town, that you can kind of get away from your busybody relatives maybe a lot easier. But then in Iceland, I think sometimes there was just the sort of the social norms aren't as maybe much enforced. But yeah, there's a lot of variation, basically.
Okay, so Chris Latham wants to know, while reading the book, I was interested in the alternatives for marriage in the Viking world, specifically the fact that some women were trained in poetry, specifically skaldic verse. How much evidence is there of female poets within Norse literature?
Yeah, there's a bit. There's, I think, 4 or 5 that are sort of mentioned. This is obviously relative to dozens of men, so it wouldn't have been very common. But certainly it does seem to have been something that happened once in a while. Maybe if you could picture just a girl being really good at it, and maybe paying attention to when her brother was being trained or something like that. And then if she was really, really talented, they would have kind of made space for that.
Okay. There is an interesting question here. We have come to the end of our advertised time, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind answering a few more questions because they are pouring in.
Oh, wow.
Yes, that's very sweet of you. So what did researching your book entail, and what was the most surprising thing you learned in the course of writing your book?
The research mainly entailed sitting in the library and just reading tons and tons of I mean, I knew the sagas and the poetry pretty well because I'm a literary scholar originally. So what I studied most intensively was archaeology and the runestone material, because that was what I needed to fill in. But when I was reading through all of that, I think I hadn't really grasped just how enormously important the textile work was, and just if women had gone on strike, like there was a women's strike in the 70s in Iceland, and society stopped working, and I think if Viking women had gone on strike, no one would have clothes, and there wouldn't have been any Viking ships and so on. And I hadn't really grasped, for example, how hugely expensive a sail was.
Yes, because without sails, none of this, our whole history, and not just Viking history, but our history would have been different.
Yes.
So John Hood would like to know, would it have been possible for a female slave, such as from Ireland, to become accepted and have similar rights as a Viking woman?
I doubt that very much. Obviously, the sources that we have are, a couple of 100 years removed from the written sources from the Viking Age. But I mean, life was extremely tough, and people died really young because their bodies were just so worn out. And so I think, given that people don't marry for love, they marry in order to make an alliance with another family and so on. And so you're not really going to marry, an Irish enslaved woman and lift her social position in that way if it's not going to benefit your own family. And so, I mean, a lot of the rights have to do with marriage and inheritance and keeping, like, controlling where property goes when someone dies and marries and so on. So I very much doubt that, even if you were really charming and so on, that you would have been able to incorporate yourself in society that way.
Okay, so Romy wants to know, where is the ship which was found with 2 Norse women? And I think, is it known where the Oseberg ship was made? Is that the same ship? Forgive me if it's not.
Yeah, this is the Oseberg ship. It was found, as I say, it's a little bit south of Oslo, I think maybe 100 kilometers or something. And I went there, like a friend took me there just a couple of months ago, and the photo that this is August, and yeah, I mean, you can just drive up to it and see it, and there's a really interesting story as well about that they excavated the entire thing, and then closed it up and everything. And then I can't remember when it was, but a few decades ago they actually put the bodies back into the ground, and then they excavated them again in 2009 or something. So there's kind of been a lot of debate about what to do with bones, I guess. But then they did all this new analysis when they re-excavated them, and yeah, they were able to discover when the trees for this ship were felled. I think that was in 820 or so, and then they've built like a replica ship, and it's really, a good ship, and it's obviously very beautiful. And you can go and sail, I think, on the replica ship.
Oh, I see. That
Yeah.
An adventure. Maybe we can take this as our last question, although there are a few I've missed. Is there evidence for the female role of angel of death being a common practice for sacrificing slave girls? Again, something gleaned from the movies, I think.
Yeah, there is this source that I didn't actually use in the book by this Arab traveler called Ibn Fadlan. And he describes a Viking funeral of somebody who was very high status. And there is this kind of elaborate ritual where everyone's getting drunk. And then there is this slave girl who is sort of, everyone has sex with her and then she's sacrificed. And I just find the idea of this, like, it's not really in any of the other written sources in Norse, and I think it's like we don't really know who these people are and whether they're actually Norse that this traveler is describing, and there's a lot of things that don't actually fit with the Norse, so I didn't use it, given also that like a lot of what he's saying about the funerals, like I don't really, you can't go back in time and see what was actually going on during these funerals that we have, some evidence for. And for example, with the Oseberg ship, we don't know if the one woman was sacrificed with the other one, or anything. So this is all very mysterious. But yeah, I was very hesitant to use this source, just because of the sort of source critical problems, which sounds very scholarly and boring, probably.
Well, it does, especially to people who are interested in fictional characters, like myself, I must admit. So let me finish tonight with a question from Birgit Brinkkamp. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Thank you for your interesting talk. I'm wondering whether you know if there's any evidence that Lagertha, shield maiden and wife of the infamous Ragnar Lothbrok, was a historical person.
Oh, there's, she appears in the source called History of the Danes by this monk called Saxo Grammaticus, who's writing in like the late 12th century or something. And in the part of the History of the Danes, which is a really long work, where like Lathgertha appears and Ragnar, it's really fantastic and I recommend reading it. But it's also like the entire part, that entire part of the narrative, like it's very legendary, and it's very similar to some of the Icelandic legendary sagas, which are like very clearly, legend, and it's really hard without any other evidence to kind of say that, yeah, this person definitely lived, and if so, whether their life was anything similar to what's being written, in these sort of legendary mythical stories. So I think we're just going to have to accept that we'll never know.
Thank you, Johanna. This was fascinating insight into the world of Viking women. Thank you on behalf of the London History Festival, and thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening.
Thank you so much for coming and for chairing, Nina.
Brilliant. Good night, everyone.
Good night.